Behind me is the Port of Melbourne, the largest container and general cargo port in Australia, and one of the top 4 container ports in the Southern Hemisphere. Around 2,600 ships berth here every year, moving goods in and out of the country. And the port here contributes roughly $11 billion annually to the national economy and facilitates close to 30% of Australia's international goods trade. What's interesting though is that most of what you're looking at behind me is actually imports. Around half of these come from China, with the rest arriving from Southeast Asia, Europe, and the US. Now, Australia does export a lot as well. In fact, we typically export more than we import in value, but most of those exports aren't leaving from here. Australia's biggest exports are raw materials like iron ore, coal, gas, and grain, which are shipped out of specialised bulk ports across the country rather than in containers like these you see behind me here. So what's actually inside these containers? Well, clothes, electronics, furniture, vehicles, the kind of goods we use every day. There's a very high chance your phone, your car, and most of what you're wearing today entered Australia through a port like this. And that raises an important question. Why do we import all of this? Australia has clothing manufacturers, so why not produce everything locally? We used to have a domestic car industry building Fords, Holdens, and Toyotas. So why did that disappear? We have the capability to produce complex goods. So why do we rely so heavily on other countries? Well, today with the help of Ricardo, I'm going to try and answer that. Ricardo was a 19th century economist who made his fortune in financial markets, but his real contribution was a simple idea that still explains global trade today. He argued that countries shouldn't produce everything they can produce. They should specialize in what they can produce most efficiently and trade for the rest. At the core of his thinking is the idea of opportunity cost, what you give up to produce something. Ricardo showed that even if a country is capable of producing a good domestically, it can still be better off importing it if doing so frees up resources to focus on something more valuable. He challenged the idea that nations should aim to be fully self-sufficient, arguing that instead that free trade increases overall prosperity by allowing each country to focus on what it does best. Ricardo's idea is called comparative advantage, and what you're looking at behind me is one of the clearest real-world examples of it in action. So let's apply this to Australia. A great example is the automotive industry, which I mentioned before. We know that we can and did produce our own vehicles. At its peak, around 70 to 80% of new cars sold in Australia were made locally. By the 2010s, this had fallen to 10 to 15%. And by 2017, the industry was completely gone. So what changed? Ricardo's key insight is that it's not about what a country can produce, it's about what it can produce at the lowest opportunity cost. At one point, Australia did have a comparative advantage in car manufacturing. We had the infrastructure, the workforce, and the domestic demand to support it. But over time, other countries, particularly Japan, South Korea, and later China, became far more efficient at producing cars. They developed large-scale industries with lower labour costs, higher production volumes, and more specialised supply chains. As a result, the opportunity cost of producing cars in Australia increased. The labour, capital, and engineering effort used to build cars could instead be used in industries where Australia had a far stronger advantage, like mining, energy, and high-value services. So even though Australia could still build cars, it no longer made economic sense to do so, and importing them became the better option. The same idea applies to things like clothing and electronics, which are also massive imports through this port behind me here. Australia can produce both, but at a much higher cost than countries in Asia. In places like China, Vietnam, and Bangladesh, production is far more efficient, labour is cheaper, factories operate at a much larger scale, and supply chains are built around producing these things quickly and cheaply. So from Ricardo's perspective, it doesn't make sense for Australia to focus heavily on those industries. The opportunity cost at this point is simply too high. Instead, we focus on industries where we have a stronger advantage and where we are most efficient. And this is exactly what we do. Australia's economy is built around exporting industries, where we have a clear comparative advantage. Rather than competing in large-scale manufacturing, we specialise in producing raw materials and resources that we can extract and supply efficiently. Our largest exports include iron ore, coal, natural gas, gold, and agricultural products like wheat and beef. These industries benefit from Australia's natural resources and production capabilities, allowing us to produce them at a lower opportunity cost than many other countries. While these exports may be less visible than the goods arriving in the containers behind me, they make up a significant portion of Australia's export revenue. And annually, we often exceed the total value of our imports with our exports. Much of this is driven by demand from countries like China, which rely on Australian resources to support their own manufacturing industries. So while we do import finished goods, we actually export the inputs that help produce them. This exchange is a direct reflection of Ricardo's theory, where each country is specialising in what it does best and trading for the rest of those goods. So when you look at the port of Melbourne behind me, you're not just looking at containers moving in and out of the country. You're looking at a physical representation of how the global economy works. Inside these containers are goods that Australia could produce but chooses not to because it's more efficient to trade. And at the same time, the things we do produce are being shipped out from other ports across the country to the rest of the world.